Welcome, everyone, to the audience here at COP26 and to those of you who are watching live at home from across the world. My name is Hulda Solst. I'm Deputy General Secretary of Education International. Education International is a global union federation of education unions. We have 383 member organizations representing more than 32 million teachers and education support personnel in 178 countries. So, we believe Education International is the voice of educators globally. It's 7 p.m. in Glasgow at the moment. It is the eve of the COP26 thematic day focusing on the critical role of education in climate action. We are at a pivotal moment. Tomorrow, education and environment ministers will have the opportunity to make ambitious commitments to strengthen their education systems to support climate action. With tonight's event, Education and Climate Policies, Are Countries Making the Grade? Education International launches a new analysis assessing countries' inclusion of education in their nationally determined contribution. Our research shows, unfortunately, that education continues to be overlooked in climate strategies, but we can make that change. It also shows that we are far from achieving educators' vision around the world, as laid out in Education International's Manifesto on Quality Climate Education for All. The Manifesto calls for universal, transformative climate education that is based on science, centered around social justice, and which fosters civic engagement. This is far from the current reality globally. But this does not mean that we are without hope. We hope that the research presented and the discussion we will have tonight acts as a wake-up call and, courtesy of education representatives from across the world, a lesson. Tomorrow is an opportunity to make a strong, time-bound pledge to prioritize and finance climate education. Don't miss this opportunity. We will hear this evening from policymakers, from educators, and from students. They will provide their perspectives on where we are now on climate education, but also where we need to go, and how we can work together to transform education systems globally to be fit for purpose in the context of the climate crisis. So, to kick off, it is my pleasure to introduce researcher Christina Kwok, education consultant, research director at Unbounded Associates, and non-resident fellow at Brookings. She will present the key findings from her research. She will do her presentation via video. So let's roll.
Thank you for the opportunity to present the findings of our analysis of nationally determined contributions and for the opportunity to introduce you to the Education International Climate Change Education Ambition Report Card. Many of you are gathered in Glasgow to discuss the ambition behind countries' national climate strategies and what actions they must take in order to meet the targets of the Paris Agreement. Much of these discussions are likely to be dominated by a focus on closing the emissions gap, or the difference between the projected level of greenhouse gas emissions under business as usual and the level of emissions reduction needed to achieve the 1.5 degree target. But not many of those discussions will be attending to the education gap, or the difference between our levels of climate knowledge, green skills, and climate consciousness under education as usual, and the level that these need to be increased to in order to achieve our climate mitigation, adaptation, just transition, and sustainable development goals. This is despite Article 12 of the Paris Agreement on Action for Climate Empowerment, which calls on all governments to engage in the important work of education, training, and public awareness to build the capacity and to empower all citizens to engage in climate action. In many ways, closing the emissions gap is dependent on closing the education gap. So while we must monitor and track countries' progress on closing the emissions gap, we also need to monitor and track countries' progress towards closing the climate education gap. The work that I'm about to present is our attempt to provide stakeholders with a tool to do so through the inclusion of quality climate change education in climate policies. To start, we drew on the 5 pillars of Education International's Manifesto on Quality Climate Change Education for All to develop a set of metrics by which to evaluate countries' climate change education ambition along a set of indicators of quality climate change education that we would expect to see integrated into policy. You can find these detailed in our accompanying report. While you can use these report card metrics to grade any relevant country, county, or city level policy on its inclusion of climate change education as a climate strategy, we focused our attention on using the report card metrics to grade countries' updated, revised, or new nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. As of September 30th of this year, only 95 parties, including the European Union, have done so. We analyzed all of their new NDCs. So how are these countries faring when it comes to closing the climate education gap? Overall, we have some disappointing news. Based on real scores of the 95 NDCs that we analyzed, every country failed. The 3 highest scoring countries, Cambodia, the Dominican Republic, and Colombia, still scored poorly. But as any well-meaning teacher might do after seeing all her students fail an important test, we curved everyone's grade. But even when adding 42 points to every country's score, only 17 of the 95 countries rose to the top. Notably, the majority of these countries are those with high or extremely high vulnerability to climate and environmental shocks. In addition, none of the top 20 carbon-emitting countries, nor the top 20 wealthiest countries' NDCs mention climate change education. In fact, countries with the lowest carbon emissions are more likely to mention climate change education in their NDCs. What this tells us is that countries least responsible for present-day emissions and most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change are shouldering the responsibility when it comes to incorporating climate change education as a climate strategy in their NDC. Now, let's take a moment to look at the key metrics. Overall, 20 of 95 NDCs mention climate change education, but none are calling for compulsory climate change education as a climate strategy. 11 NDCs mention teachers, but none mentions teacher unions or consulting teachers during climate stakeholder discussions. In terms of students and youth, there's been some level of improvement compared to findings from an analysis of the first round of NDCs. Specifically, 69% of NDCs reference children and youth, which is up from 42% of first NDCs. Our report card also identified women and girls as a proxy for the inclusion of vulnerable populations. Overall, 15 NDCs compared to 3 from the first round of NDCs mention girls. But none formally recognizes the contributions that an investment in girls' education could make towards their climate strategy, which is no change since the first NDCs. This includes countries that have submitted an updated, revised, or new NDC, and where climate change is expected to impact the education of girls the most. And as we move into the other metrics, countries begin to fare worse. While 41% of NDCs recognize that vulnerable groups are differentially impacted by climate change, only 8 NDCs actually mention climate justice. And you can see here in this chart that not many countries are meeting our criteria when it comes to quality climate change education. For example, no NDCs specifically call for climate change education that is based in science. 2 NDCs call for climate change education that fosters civic engagement and climate action. And 11 NDCs call for education and training to lead to careers in the green economy. Finally, countries are not paying attention to the need to strengthen education systems to support the delivery of quality climate change education, including the education workforce. For example, while 9 NDCs point to the importance of international cooperation to support education and training opportunities, only 2 NDCs specify that more funding needs to be directed to the education system. While 9 NDCs point to the need for teacher training, only 1 NDC calls for professional development opportunities that actually meet teachers' needs. And despite the anticipated destruction on education infrastructure that more frequent heat waves, intensified flooding, and other environmental hazards are likely to create and exacerbated by climate change, only 8 NDCs actually articulate the need to make education infrastructure greener and more climate resilient. So overall, climate change education ambition is poor. This is especially the case among countries most responsible for current levels of greenhouse gases. Urgent action is needed to integrate the education sector in climate decision-making, to position the education workforce as climate stakeholders, and to strengthen the capacity of education systems to engage in climate action. We must urge countries that have yet to submit their updated, revised, or new NDCs to raise their ambition on climate change education by funding, resourcing, and strengthening the education sector as a climate-relevant sector, by prioritizing quality climate change education as a climate strategy, and by involving teachers and educators as key climate stakeholders. For those countries that have already submitted their NDCs, there are still ways to act now. For example, education unions and education stakeholders can play a vital role by identifying the barriers and capacity needs of the sector, by contextualizing climate policies into learning needs, especially for the most vulnerable and most marginalized, and by using mechanisms like the Education International Climate Change Education Ambition Report Card to hold national and subnational leaders accountable. Thank you for your attention, and best of luck in Glasgow.
And I would say thank you very much to Christina for her timely and important analysis, a rather strong message. Now, we don't want that message to put us down. We want that to encourage us that we have a common challenge to move forward. And to discuss that, I have a fantastic panel next to me. Right next to me in yellow here, we have the youngest participant with us, Shreya, almost. Casey, she is a Nepalese climate justice activist and campaign coordinator for COP26. Next to her, we have the Minister David Senge, who's Minister of Basic and Senior Education, Secondary Education in Sierra Leone, and also Chief Innovation Officer in Sierra Leone. And then if we move on, we have Shirley Ann Somerville, who is the Cabinet Secretary for Education and Skills for the Scottish Government. And finally, we have Larry Flanagan, General Secretary of the Education Institute of Scotland, EIS. He is also President of ETUCE, which is the European region of Education International. I'd like to start in the middle. I'd like to start with Minister Senge. Sierra Leone's national determined contribution, because you have mentioned education, and you scored within the top 20 of the 95 countries, which, is quite impressive if we look at that list. It's one in less than a dozen countries that highlights the importance of climate change education that prepares students for careers in the green economy. It is also one of only a handful of countries who NDC's positions children and youth as a priority group. It's very positive to see that you've managed to put climate policies on the agenda in Sierra Leone. I would like you to comment on, as a perspective of a minister, what do you consider the key components to be able to have quality education on climate change in your country?
Thank you very much, and thank you, Christina, for that excellent presentation. While it sounds like we're doing relatively well in Sierra Leone, I must say, as a policymaker listening to that, I kept thinking, we can do more. We can certainly do more. And as the Chief Innovation Officer, I was a little disappointed that Sierra Leone didn't make it in the science use for climate education. But I think just in the last cabinet meeting that I was in, there was extensive conversation at cabinet level that was around climate education and the inclusion of gender, particularly focusing on gender. So a major component for us has been the leadership of His Excellency President Julius Maada Bio. I do think that if you perhaps wait to see the updated strategy and action plan, elements of it that will be incorporated from that cabinet conclusion last week actually does focus on gender specifically. But I think to your question around how we can get teachers more involved, I think some of the work that we've been doing in Sierra Leone is the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, has been able to set up these nature clubs at schools. And when we think about activities of students, not just in the classroom and outside the classroom, we've been able to set up activities that focus on climate education as well. There's an ongoing essay competition that I launched maybe 2 months ago with a private sector bank. And the topic there that all students, all secondary school students can participate on was around resilience and climate and actions that students can take. So we are bringing this to the schools. We're now looking to challenge students to think about those solutions. And as a government and as a ministry, I'm looking to see how we can implement those, not just through the nature clubs and entities, but also with the kids in the communities. With regards to incorporation of teachers, I think we can do better. It's an area that I took notes on and something that I definitely will go back home and think and reflect on how we can get our teachers. But to end, we have what we call the National Civic Education and Development Department. They're actually very involved with climate action and resilience. Perhaps the feedback for me, I suppose, as well, is that those different work that is happening outside the Ministry of Environment and outside education that actually touch on civic education and public sector education, we need to be able to capture in these documents that represent us at a global level, because there is several other work that's happening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Sengen. I think you pointed something very important that touches me as a teacher, that it's so important that you have a whole school approach and that you have a whole community approach, that we don't address this as a silo, but as something that crosses across all subjects and also connects students and their schools to their communities. And that's what I'm hearing. I like that. If I may move on to Minister Somerville, that Scotland has also recognized the important role that education has to play to ensure a sustainable and just future. Can you perhaps tell us about the main elements of the Learning for Sustainability framework and how it's being implemented?
Thank you, and thanks for the invitation to come along and to talk about what's happening in Scotland. So we've had our Learning for Sustainability for around 10 years now, and it's something which we are keen to further develop, and I'm sure we will learn lessons from the discussions tonight. One of the key areas around this is around an entitlement for every student to have Learning for Sustainability as part of their process. Also looking at the teachers to ensure that as they are moving through their initial teacher education, that they are provided with the support to be able to take that into the classroom, so they are confident teachers in this, to allow confident learners to approach, and also looking to ensure that within our teaching standards within Scotland, that this is part of the teaching standards. But that aspect around whole school approach is integral to this, because we need to ensure that this isn't just about one inspirational teacher that brings this into a school and is brilliant at doing that, but may move on to another job, or it doesn't happen in every single school in Scotland. And those are the aspects around that whole school approach, the whole community approach, then bringing in their parents, bringing in wider community activities, that is integral to taking this from just outside a classroom to actually then a whole of a Scottish community. So there is a great deal of work that we can do. And another key aspect of Learning for Sustainability is it's not just about climate change or climate action. It's ensuring that we are encouraging our children and young people to grow up as global citizens. So they are critical thinkers about their role, not just in climate change, but in other aspects around the world as well. So they are not just being taught a subject, but they're being inspired to be the change that will need to happen as part of the next generation. And they are very much taking that forward within Scotland. And another key aspect, I think, about what we're doing in Scotland in general is around children's rights, and about embedding the United Nations Convention for the Rights of the Child, and ensuring that children and young people have a very, very key role as we develop our education policies, and ensuring that they have just as I have good relationships mostly with our trade union colleagues within Scotland and a good discussion and conversation around there, but how do we make sure that we're not just talking to teachers, but we're actually at the same table having that same type of conversation with children and young people who are also leading that change as well?
Thank you very much, Minister. And I think that was, a very important handover to Shreya, who's here, because it's about teachers, yes. And I'm very pleased to hear that you have invested in making sure that teachers have the knowledge and competence to do the teaching they need to do. Those of them that are trained in the area I am trained were not trained to teach neither sustainable development or climate education. So we need to upgrade, but we need to involve the students who it's all about, to make them competent citizens. So Shreya, I would like to ask you of your experience on climate education policies as a student in Nepal. Do you feel that you've received quality climate change education?
Yes, thank you for that question. Thank you again for inviting me in this discussion. If I have to say this in one word, I would say no. And when I was in school, there was a subject called science, and in that, we used to study about air, water, the physical, chemical, and the biological things, but not about environment, climate change, and all. And when I joined my bachelor's in environment science, that was a complete coincidence, but when I joined my environment science, at the very first day of my study, I learned about climate change. And I was like, seriously, is this happening? Is there a problem that is causing the that has the threat to wipe out the entire existence of human? This is impossible. I used to think like that. So I was very much afraid when I knew about climate change at the beginning. So there was no education, climate education before that. And I studied environment science as my major subject. And in there also, there is not much about climate change. In my 4th year, I have to study one subject, which is which has a bit less hours. And in that, we study about policies and those different types of things. So definitely, I didn't got quality climate education when I will grow up. But I have my brother who is studying now at class 12. And while he was studying in school, in that subject, it was not just science for him, it was science and environment for him. And in that, he used to read a bit about climate change, environment and all, but it was not a complete package what those students need to learn. So I think the way is a bit improving, but Nepal can also still do better. And talking about the policies, we don't have specific policy that emphasizes climate education. We have one called National Climate Change Policy, which is the umbrella policy, and it guides everything around climate change. And in that, there is a sector called awareness and capacity building. And in that, it prioritizes that the focal points of school, they will be educated about climate change, and teachers will be provided training, and eco clubs will be established in different schools. But they are in the policies, but it is still to be implemented in the action. Yes, that is about Nepal.
Well, I'm glad to hear that although it's not perfect, that you do register that things are moving in the right direction. Now let's see if we can speed up so we don't have to go through many generations. Larry, you have the privilege of sitting next to your minister, who we have heard that Scotland has invested in empowering teachers and making them capable to teach on climate change. I'd like your perspective. How ready and empowered do you feel from your seat that teachers are?
No, thank you, Haldis, and good evening, colleagues. Thank you in particular, Haldis, for not introducing me as the oldest member of the panel, which I clearly am. And I'll come back to that in a second. But we do have a really strong push between government and the teacher unions around empowerment as an agenda in Scottish education. So we recognise the key role of teachers in schools in terms of delivery. And although we don't have a directed curriculum, the Curriculum for Excellence framework, which Shirley Ann referenced there, and which I was around when we started talking about it, has a very clear thread in it called Learning for Sustainability, which is climate education. And 10, 15 years ago, this was quite innovative to put this into our curriculum framework. So schools and teachers are enabled around this cross-curricular agenda to ensure that we have climate education within it. I think a really important dynamic, and we're here in Glasgow at COP26, there are tens of thousands of people here who have a strong political motivation around climate change, as the trade unions do. But for educators, we also have a really strong pedagogical investment in climate education, because we know that young people are invested and are interested in this topic. And as educators, we know that if your students are engaged in the topic, then learning and teaching is more effective. So in our schools, we have teachers across the country who are engaged in climate education because it's an agenda that works in terms of engaging students in the education process. And I think that's a really important message for others to recognise, that our education system is about the future. And as teachers, we are invested and we're optimistic about the future. And we also have an agenda there which is shared between the teacher and the learner, and it makes learning more effective. So I do think it's important that systems do empower teachers through their curricular structures, through their support for teachers, and through the daily practice in classrooms, for climate education to be central to young people's experience. And I think from that, we are all winners. Young people are winners in terms of their education, and as a community, we are winners in terms of moving the climate change agenda forward.
Thanks a lot, Larry. And I think that from you, we're going to go to another trade unionist. And we're going to listen to a video from someone that I know very much wanted to be here, but unfortunately couldn't make the travel. And that is the General Secretary of the South African Democratic Teachers Union, Mogoena Maluleke, who is also Vice President of Africa at the global level Executive Board of Education International. So let's listen to Mogoena.
Our country is making the grade. The climate crisis is the greatest threat facing our planet, and South Africa can never divorce herself from this threat. We have little time left to turn around the tide, and education is critical in doing so. In South Africa, climate change education is poor, and this is especially the case among countries most responsible for current levels of greenhouse gases. Urgent action among education and climate stakeholders is needed to integrate the education sector in climate policy and decision-making, position the education workforce as climate stakeholders, and strengthen the capacity of education systems to engage in climate action. A few countries' progress on the climate change education demonstrates that it is possible to prioritize climate change education alongside climate strategies in energy, transportation, and other technical sectors. The education sector can learn from the success of gender advocates, which have helped countries see that gender equality is a cross-cutting issue in their climate strategies. We therefore have the following recommendations. We need the funding, resources, and strengthening of education system as a climate-relevant sector. We need to prioritize as a climate strategy quality climate change education that is based on science, orientated to climate action, and takes an intersectional approach to climate justice. As education trade unions, we need to identify the barriers and capacity needs of the education workforce and the education system to address the climate crisis, contextualize the NDCs and other climate policies into the learning needs of the most vulnerable and marginalized students. Develop mechanisms like the EI Climate Change Education Ambition Report Card to hold local, national, regional, and global decision makers accountable for the climate change education policy and implementation. The countries are not making the grade. What they are doing is greenwashing. Let's save the planet. Let's save our future.
So a strong message there from South Africa. Let's look forward, because we have this common challenge, and thoughts about how can we move forward quicker than what we experienced in Nepal, so we don't have to wait too long. Let's go back to Sierra Leone first. You talked about this in your first interventions, about some commitments to further enhance the development of your climate change education. Some thoughts on it, but can you reflect some bit more, Minister Senge, on how you see the opportunity of moving further within Sierra Leone? I know you've had a campaign on radical inclusion when it comes to those left out. Perhaps radical climate change education?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I do want to, first of all, say these dialogues, these conversations are important. So I'll definitely look to my colleague to learn about your curriculum framework. In the basic education curriculum framework in Sierra Leone, we did include climate education there and environment, and we're just developing the senior secondary school one. So I'll send you an email on that. But in terms of looking forward, actually, and in the interest of all making commitments, my team today actively is out all across the country developing and socializing our education sector plan. It's a 5-year plan starting next year, and it touches on several other things. I think I took notes that I'll probably challenge them tonight to see if they can have a section on climate education in our upcoming education sector plan. And I think it will be a challenge for me and the team and everybody, because it's a very highly consultative process that we've gone through. And it's a sector plan from pre-primary all the way to higher and technical. And I think perhaps in terms of action that they're calling up, that everybody should be calling about, it's not just that it should be in our nationally determined contributions. I think it's that when we develop our education sector plans, it should be there. Climate action should be there. So I think Sierra Leone will make that commitment, and I think in our upcoming ESP, we will have a section on climate action.
Fantastic. So then we move to your neighbour next to you in the north, to Scotland, and you have something in place, but I expect that you have ambitions to move even further.
Well, very much, and I think as our First Minister Nicola Sturgeon has said, as she's attended events at COP26, small nations such as Scotland can play an integral part in our development on this global process, and we need to seize that opportunity. So, as Larry said, when Learning for Sustainability came in 10 years or so ago, it was highly innovative. It was new, there wasn't that many countries that were doing it. We need to make sure it's fit for the future, though, and we're going through that process, speaking to climate change activists, young people, to raise our game effectively, to make sure that it is as good as it possibly can be. And importantly doing that, I think, after COP26, to make sure that we are bringing in all the information and learning that we can from this. The other, I think, challenge we have, and I touched on it briefly in my last answer, was we need to make sure this is a part of every single school. So we have a system. I visited some fantastic schools in my time as Education Secretary and in previous roles that show this works, and the inspiration that the children have in terms of not just climate change but that global citizenship is there to see. But we need to make sure that's in every school, and not just in every school, but way into our early learning, and also as we move out of formal education settings to colleges, to universities and so on. So how do we embed this within a wider education sector? So there's a lot I think we still need to do, and particularly tying it into the opportunities that are here. And again, we've spoken about this, I know, in different parts of COP26, about ensuring that our, not just young people, but those who need to reskill, have the skills that are ready to take the necessary transition from the industries that we have at the moment to the green skills that they will require from the future. So where are our innovators? Where are the people who will be working in those industries that are still quite embryonic? And we want that to be in Scotland, but we can't have that unless we ensure that we're getting young people inspired into that and teaching them the skills that they're required to come out of the education system and move into those industries that we want to see in Scotland that will allow us to have that just transition and allow us to move to that net zero state that we need to get to. So there's a lot of challenges within this. We've got a good foundation, but we're certainly not resting on our laurels about where we can go next.
That's great that you're not resting on laurels, because none of us can. We don't have the time for it. Now, you say you started so much work, and it gives me a reflection of something positive that also unions can do. That my own union this week had their annual climate conference. They have a climate conference once a year. And at that climate conference, and I think it's the 10th year, they give recognition to schools that have done good work on climate, not just on, yes, on climate change education. And this means that they collect good examples. When you've been doing that for 10 years, and they awarded one award to early childhood education institution, one to a primary school, and one to a secondary school. So that you are collecting good examples, and you invite the students and the teachers to present together what they're doing. And that is one way of sharing the positives that can be done, and we can do it together. Or can we do it together? So I'm going to ask Shreya again, what are your hopes for the future of how we're going to move a bit quicker to get forward in Nepal or all other countries? What can we do, even more than what has been said?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So when we say that we want action on climate change, we are not only talking about we should invest in renewable energies and like those sort of things, but also we're asking that there should be the investment in climate education and all, because climate education is an untapped resources, and we need everyone to be educated about climate change so that they can take action on climate change. Many of the youngsters today, like they are suffering from, they're feeling climate anxiety. And to solve the problem of climate anxiety, young people should be taught about climate change from the very early age, so that caring about the environment, reducing own footprint, and those sort of things will be a part of their lifestyle, not just something that would be embedded when they will grow up. And like we can make progress on climate education by especially schools. They have very much critical role. There should be the mandatory climate education that should be up-to-date, integrated, and comprehensive, and that should be based on that reason. For example, the courses that are prepared in Europe and America cannot be taught in schools of Nepal, right? So there are different contexts, there are different success stories, so that should be incorporated in that studies label. And the second one is like the courses that they should not only be the theoretical things, there should be the mechanism so that the students, the young people, they can do those things, like the things that learn in their school, in different things, like trainings and all, they can implement those things in action, for example, through the formation of eco-clubs, organizing different programs and all. That is the thing. And another one is not just limiting climate education inside the students group in schools and all, because there are lots of young people who are outside schools. So creating some kind of mechanism to teach everyone about climate change, not like especially young people, but not just young people, like everyone should be taught about climate change. And lastly, what we can do is like prepare educational materials that is freely accessible to everyone, because everyone does not has that resources and privilege to go to school, to read, to access the online resources. So those kind of things can be prepared to enhance climate education. It applies for Nepal also and for other countries also, I guess. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think you highlighted some very important points, like that you can't copy-paste teaching and learning materials from one country to another, that they need to be relevant in the context where they're going to be used, so they need to be bottom-up. And again, you circle back to the whole school, whole community concept, so you connect in school with out of school, and make sure that everyone has the common framework and knowledge. Fantastic. Larry, What do you think are the 3 top priority reforms that will make a difference for teachers to be able to do their job at the level they want to do it?
Top 3. That's unfortunate. I'd learned the 5 EI demands. So I'll distill them into 3. I think the first one we have touched on, which is that in our school systems, climate education has to be embedded in the curriculum. So it has to have a strong profile, whether it's a framework, whether it's a directed curriculum, it has to be highly profiled within our curriculum structures, and that's the starting point. I think, secondly, to look at the teachers, and to echo a point you made, Haldis, I think we have to ensure that teachers have the knowledge they need to deliver effective climate education, and not assume that that knowledge is there already. When I was a young teacher in the 80s, we depended on North Sea oil, and we were fighting to keep the coal mines open. So the world has moved on, and we have to make sure that teachers have the knowledge, and then the professional learning, the professional development, to take that knowledge into the pedagogical approaches in the classroom, and to engage young people in that agenda. And then I think the last point, almost to return to your first question, is that teachers have to have agency. They have to be empowered to pursue this agenda in the classroom. And I think it's a hugely productive agenda. I've been sharing with colleagues on EIS website. We have an exhibition of work that young people have produced in relation to not COP26, just in relation to learning for sustainability. And if you go on and look at it, it's truly inspiring in terms of the hope and optimism that young people have that things can change. And I just think our education system, its primary purpose is to nurture that hope and ambition amongst our young people, because that really is our best bet for a change in the future.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you one last question, as a quick one, around all of you. We have some minutes left, because you represent different countries, different groupings within your countries, but we keep referencing to the need that when we deliver education, that it's holistic, that it includes all, that it's not sort of limited to a subject or to a classroom or even to a school. Then we need collaboration. None of us can do this on our own, but we all represent something. So I would like you some quick thoughts on how can we enhance collaboration so that we become strong, because we could become many with the same agenda. Anyone want to start?
Well, I'll start because I have the microphone. I think it's a really good question, and you mentioned, Haldis, I'm president of the European region, so I'm aware of countries across Europe where there is no social dialogue, where teachers are not consulted by government. And it's really telling when you look at the most effective systems, because a hallmark of the effective systems is that they have social dialogue. They have collaborative practice. And as Shirley-Ann said, it doesn't mean we always agree, but we are in the room talking about the same agenda. And when we do agree, as with climate education, that becomes a much more powerful dynamic, because it's not government telling teachers, it is a collaborative approach. And I think a collaborative approach based on trust in any aspect of education is absolutely critical to success. So I think collaboration is certainly the agenda we need to embrace.
I think absolutely echo Larry's point. I'm particularly struck in all my time as government minister that I think you make the best policies when you start by listening, not by thinking that government has all the answers, but actually to genuinely go out, listen, to co-produce, to co-design, where you can go with things. Now, that's not always possible, and there's not always consensus on a wide variety of issues, whether it's on education or on anything else. But on this, there actually really can be quite a lot of consensus about where we want to get to, about what we want to achieve through our education system. And I think we do that best if we have everybody around the table with policymakers, with whether it's the trade unions, whether it's with young people, whether it's with parents, and we sit together and actually work out where we want to get to, by when, and how we want to do that. And if we can achieve that, which I think we can on these issues, then I think we stand the best chance of success. So I think one of the key for governments is not to think you have all the answers, and to actually genuinely take a step back and listen to where people want to go on this, particularly young people, but educators as well. And by that way, we can get the best solutions.
Thank you. I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, in terms of what we're doing in Sierra Leone, actually, that I'm very proud to share. I think just last week, Tuesday, I think, we had a government civil society dialogue that was led by the vice president in the north, and we'd all traveled there, and you had 30 plus CSOs and several government ministers and the vice president talking about service delivery. And one of the other things that we've done in Sierra Leone is I established a CSO consortium in the education sector and engaged them to go across the country and engage people on some of our policies. And the Sierra Leone Teachers Union, who's a member of the organization, also is working with us in our review of our act. So it's really engaging the unions and the civil society and giving them a role to play within the sector. And I think across government, often we feel like collaboration is just with non-state actors. But even with state actors, it's easy to not collaborate with state actors. And I think for us, for me, definitely one of the takeaway out of this is how we, that if we want to have a responsive curriculum or set of programs, the Ministry of Environment, the civic education, the teacher training institutions, the disaster management, they all have to be in there. But I do want to perhaps end on noting that if we do want to take climate action, if we do want to have stuff that's really meaningful, then we have to measure it. And I think another thing that I definitely will take back, that I'll definitely take back to Sierra Leone and commit my team to, is in our annual school census, where we measure a whole bunch of 100+ variables, that we need to explore how we measure climate action at school level, as we're talking about. So it's not something we're doing now. It's something I definitely can see that my team, that I would love to explore with my team in how to do. And to do that, you have to collaborate with everybody across the sector.
Adding on those points, governments, like, they can prepare the policies that talks about climate education and all, and not only preparing the policies, but also separating resources to achieve those commitments. And teachers, what they can do is, I think, ask with the students, like, what kind of things they want to learn, what kind of things they want to have in their education system. And with that consultation process and conversation with the students, the curriculum, courses, the different educational materials can be designed in that way. And what we can do also is to establish the eco clubs in different schools. The teachers, they can encourage the students to work in those kind of things and all. And the government, what they can do, I think, is to have a target, like, for example, 80% of the people will get climate education by 2022. Like, I think if we have those sort of ambitious target by year, then I think that will pressurize and encourage at the same time for all the students and teachers to meet those commitments. And lastly, encouragement. I think finance is important, funding is important, but more than that, I think empowerment and encouragement is very essential. For example, those teachers, those students who are doing best on climate education, I think if they are awarded, prioritized, and if those success stories can be replicated in other parts, I think that would be the best. Thank you.
Fantastic. All of you, thank you very much. I think you have pointed at very many important points. I sense a will to do more than you already have done and to move forward. I think, Shreya, you also pointed at the end there that it's great to have the ambitions, to have the goals, but we must never forget the bottlenecks that often hit us when we have educational reform. And they're on implementation, how they get from the government offices into the classrooms to empower people all the way. And unfortunately, it often is about finances. And we need both in place to be able to move forward, because we need to re-educate our teachers to be able to educate their students and have the knowledge and time and space and feel it's important. And there comes your goals. They must be aspirational, and you must report on them in the way you do in the country, like you say, Minister Senge. So I think that we have been able to get a lot of pointers here, and I want to thank you all for contributing, for interesting, important insights. I hope the next time that we do a research on the state of the art, that we're going to get a different result than the one Christina presented earlier today. And I would like to close by reiterating my call to policymakers around the world that tomorrow, some of you may be there, is your opportunity to take that lead and make ambitious commitments for climate education and for financing of it, based on science, centered on climate justice, and with a civic component. Seize the moment tomorrow. Thank you to all the viewers joining us here and at home. And I will leave you with a call to action to support Education International's Manifesto on Quality Education for All. We have all kinds of stickers for those that you are here, so you can access it directly. Thank you very much.